The gate groaned as it opened. Cold morning light spilled into the yard like a blade, cutting through rows of tired German prisoners who stood frozen, breaths trembling in the winter air. Boots scraped on gravel. A guard walked in, holding a wooden box. No one dared to breathe. They expected clubs. They expected orders. They expected humiliation. But then the guard stopped, placed the box on a table, and opened it. Inside were pencils, hundreds of them, sharpened, clean, untouched by war. The prisoners stared in silence. And then he said only 3 words, calm and almost gentle. Write your dreams. No one understood. No one moved. They had waited for punishment. But something impossible had begun, and none of them knew what it would mean. Ladies and gentlemen, history carries many loud stories, stories of battles, victories, invasions, and burning skies. But today I want to tell you one of its quietest stories. A story whispered inside barbed wire fences. A story born not from gunfire, but from a wooden box filled with sharpened pencils. It begins at the end of a long war, with men who had marched across Europe believing they were invincible, and who now stood behind enemy wire, believing they were doomed. German prisoners of war, cold, exhausted, and stripped of everything they once were. They arrived in American camps carrying a single heavy emotion: fear, a fear so deep it lived inside their bones. They had heard the rumors. The Americans will beat you. They will starve you. They will make you pay for every inch of blood this war has cost. So when the gates closed behind them, they lowered their eyes and waited for punishment. But history has a way of surprising those who think they already know its ending, because the punishment they feared never came. Instead, they found war meals instead of chains, medical tents instead of torture rooms, and guards who watched them, not with hatred, but with a strange, quiet curiosity. Still, fear does not vanish easily in men who have lived too close to death. Every footstep of an American guard made them stiffen. Every shout made their hearts strike like hammers. They slept with one eye open, certain that kindness was only a mask for cruelty yet to come. And then one morning, everything changed. A young American officer walked into the yard holding a wooden box. The prisoners stood in silence, waiting, bracing, preparing for the blow that would finally fall. The officer placed the box on a table, opened the lid, and stepped back. Inside were pencils, hundreds of them, clean, sharpened, waiting. Confusion rippled through the ranks of prisoners. Finally, the officer spoke. No anger, no threat, just a voice that seemed almost tired. These are not for reports, not for discipline. Write your dreams. For a moment, the world froze. Men who had seen towns burn, who had watched friends die in mud and snow, stared at pieces of wood that weighed almost nothing, yet felt heavier than their rifles ever had. Write your dreams. What dreams? War had stolen their futures, their beliefs, their sense of who they were. But something happened when those pencils touched paper. At first, their hands trembled. Shame and fear still clung to them like shadows. But the lines began to form. Slowly, painfully honestly. Some wrote about the homes they left behind. Some wrote about the guilt they carried. Others wrote about the simple desire to sit at a kitchen table again, to hear their children laugh, to plant seeds in soil instead of bodies in the earth. And for those few minutes behind American wire, these men who had once been soldiers became human beings again. The Americans did not ask them to justify their actions. They did not ask them to confess. They simply asked them to remember who they were before the world turned them into weapons. Day by day, something shifted in the camp. The prisoners stood straighter. They spoke more softly. They began to understand that not every enemy comes to break you. Some come to rebuild what war has shattered. And the Americans, reading dreams written in shaky German handwriting, also realized something. Sometimes, the most powerful victory is not won with fire or steel, but with mercy. Because mercy forces a man to face himself, to ask, how did I become who I am? And who do I want to be when this war is finally over? Ladies and gentlemen, in a conflict remembered for brutality, in a war that showed the worst of what humanity can become, there were still moments where light entered through the cracks. A pencil, a piece of paper, a chance to dream. It did not erase the crimes of a regime. It did not erase the suffering of nations. But it reminded the world of something vital. War destroys nations, but humanity rebuilds people. And so, when history tells us about the great powers, the mighty battles, the soaring rhetoric of leaders, let us also remember the quiet scenes inside those camps, where frightened men waited for punishment, and instead were handed the rarest gift war can offer, a second chance at being human. In the end, that officer never knew what those dreams became. But he understood this. Peace begins long before treaties are signed. It begins the moment we choose compassion over cruelty. War took everything from those men, but through a simple act of kindness, humanity gave a part of it back. Thank you. German POWs did not enter American camps as soldiers. They entered as shadows of themselves, carrying a kind of fear that lived deeper than hunger or exhaustion. By 1944 and 1945, the German army had endured years of brutal combat, relentless retreat, and the collapse of everything they had been taught to believe. Many had survived the Eastern Front, where capture often meant death, starvation, or torture. Others had heard stories of Allied vengeance, whispered in bunkers and trenches. If they take you alive, pray you die quickly. Propaganda had fed them the idea that Americans were monsters, men who hated Germans with a fury that would burn them alive. So when these soldiers were finally captured, drenched in rain, mud, and despair, the moment the U.S. camps appeared on the horizon, their minds were prepared for the worst. Some expected to be beaten the moment they stepped off the trucks. Others believed they would be forced into violent labor or thrown into holes like animals. And almost all of them carried deep psychological scars, fear that twisted their stomachs and made their hands shake even when no danger was present. War had hollowed them out long before the Americans ever saw them. Stepping inside the camps, they noticed every detail through the lens of their fear. The barbed wire seemed sharper than anywhere else. The guard towers looked taller. The boots of American soldiers sounded like hammers striking the ground. Every shout, every whistle, every clang of a gate felt like the beginning of something dark. These men did not expect kindness. They did not even expect fairness. They expected punishment for a war they no longer understood, for orders they had followed, for a cause that had collapsed under its own lies. Some of them whispered prayers. Others kept their eyes glued to the dirt, afraid that eye contact alone might trigger violence. Even the simple act of receiving food became a moment of dread. They waited for insults, for blows, for humiliation that never came. And the absence of cruelty confused them more than cruelty itself would have. Some prisoners later admitted they were more frightened by American silence than by Soviet rage. Silence meant unpredictability. Unpredictability meant danger. Inside the barracks at night, fear took on a different form. It lived in the creaking of wooden bunks, in the distant footsteps of patrolling guards, in the cold wind slipping through the canvas walls. Men lay awake staring at the ceiling, imagining every possible scenario that might come with the sunrise. Some wondered if the Americans were simply waiting to break them psychologically. Others thought they were being fattened before punishment arrived. No one trusted the stillness. After years of war, stillness felt unnatural, as if the world were holding its breath before striking. Many POWs carried guilt. Guilt for surviving when their friends had not, guilt for serving a regime they barely understood, guilt for believing lies they now saw clearly. Shame and fear mixed together until it was impossible to separate one from the other. This was the emotional state of German POWs upon arrival. Frightened, conditioned by propaganda, mentally broken, and prepared for a punishment that never came. And because they expected darkness, the smallest act of mercy felt impossible. That is why what happened next. The moment Americans handed them pencils and said, "Write your dreams," struck them harder than any weapon ever could. For German POWs, the shock did not come in one dramatic moment, but in small, steady contradictions that struck deeper than any punishment ever could. The first contradiction was food. Many had marched across ruined Europe eating grass, frozen potatoes, or nothing at all. They had watched civilians fight over scraps, had seen soldiers steal bread from children, had felt the slow fire of starvation burning away strength and dignity. So when they stood in line expecting half-rotten rations or watery soup, the sight of full trays, meat, vegetables, bread still warm, made them recoil in disbelief. Some prisoners later confessed they thought it was a trick. They ate slowly, waiting for the guards to snatch the plates away or mock them for their hunger. But the Americans simply watched, indifferent, almost casual. To feed an enemy well was not kindness, it was policy. But to men raised in a culture of fear, it felt like impossible mercy. Then came the second contradiction: medical care. Many prisoners carried untreated wounds, frostbite, infections, shrapnel buried under skin, fevers left to burn without medicine. German field hospitals had collapsed in the last months of the war, leaving soldiers to rot where they fell. So when American medics examined them without anger, when they offered bandages and antibiotics, when they spoke with a gentleness the Germans had not expected from their enemies, it created a kind of emotional dizziness. Some POWs wept silently during treatment, not from pain, but from confusion. They had been told the Americans hated them. Yet these men, these supposed monsters, cleaned their wounds with steady hands. Work assignments were another surprise. Instead of beatings or forced marches, prisoners were given structured tasks: cooking, lifting, farming, repairing tools. The work was not easy, but it was fair. They were paid in canteen coupons, allowed to buy cigarettes, coffee, stationery, even small sweets. Many felt a strange guilt. Why should they, the defeated, be allowed such comforts when their own families back home were starving? That guilt sat heavy in their stomachs, making the kindness feel sharper, more painful. Kindness from the enemy forced them to look inward, to question the propaganda they had believed, the leaders they had trusted, the war they had fought. They also heard music. American guards played radios in the distance, jazz, swing, voices filled with life and rhythm. At night, when the camp settled into uneasy silence, melodies drifted through the air like foreign dreams. Some prisoners admitted the music frightened them more than silence. It made them realize how much humanity they had lost in the chaos of war. The biggest contradiction arrived during roll call, when a guard picked up a fallen prisoner's cap and handed it back politely, almost respectfully. The prisoner didn't take it at first. He thought it was a test, a trap. The guard only shrugged and walked away. Moments like these cracked something inside many of the POWs. Hatred had been easy on the battlefield. Hatred was simple, clean, predictable. But this confusing blend of discipline and decency forced them to confront a truth they were not ready for. The enemy they feared was not the enemy they met. Little by little, the walls they had built inside themselves began to tremble. Not fall, just tremble. And trembling was enough for hope to slip in, quietly, like a draft entering a closed room. But even then, none of them understood what this strange American mercy was leading to. They did not know the pencils were coming. They did not know their captors would soon ask them to do something they had forgotten how to do: dream. No one in the camp expected the moment that would change everything. It began quietly, almost without purpose, as if history itself was testing how softly a transformation could start. One morning, when the sun was still low and the frost clung like dust to the fence wires, an American officer carried a wooden box into the yard. The prisoners stiffened immediately. Boxes usually meant tools, orders, punishment, inventory, never anything gentle. The officer set it down without a word. His expression wasn't stern, but it wasn't friendly either. It was something more complicated, something between duty and curiosity. When he lifted the lid, the prisoners leaned in slightly, prepared for the unexpected. What they saw inside made no sense. Not weapons, not chains, not documents to sign in fear. Instead, stacks of notebooks, blank sheets of paper, and rows of pencils sharpened to perfect points. The kind of pencils schoolchildren might use. the kind of pencils that belonged to a world untouched by gunfire. Nothing in their training taught them how to react to such an object. A rifle you could understand, a command you could obey, but a pencil? A simple piece of wood and graphite? It felt more dangerous than a weapon because it demanded something the prisoners no longer believed they possessed: inner truth. The Americans didn't shout orders. They didn't call out names. The officer looked at them, tired men with hollow cheeks and guarded eyes, and said only, "Write your dreams." The words struck the air like a stone hitting water, sending ripples of confusion through every man listening. Some thought they misunderstood his English. Some thought it was a cruel joke. A few assumed it was a test: write something wrong and face punishment. But the Americans walked away, leaving the box behind like a strange offering. Slowly, uncertainly, the prisoners approached. One man touched a pencil as if it might burn him. Another picked up a sheet of paper with trembling hands, the white surface so clean it felt like a sin to mark it. For years, their thoughts had been dictated by orders, propaganda, fear. They had written reports, numbers, patrol notes, never their private thoughts. Some hadn't written anything personal since they were boys. The idea of writing a dream felt almost forbidden. But curiosity, fragile and hesitant, began to slip through the cracks that fear had carved in their minds. The first lines were stiff, clumsy. A few wrote about simple things: bread without ration stamps, a bed without lice, a morning without sirens. Others wrote about homes they hadn't seen in years. A handful dared to write about guilt, though quietly, carefully, as if the paper might denounce them. And for a few moments, as pencils scratched across paper, the war outside the fences seemed to fade. The act of writing forced them inward, made them face themselves without uniforms, without ranks, without the armor of ideology. The Americans did not read their dreams immediately. That was the most shocking part. The writing was not for interrogation, not for psychological manipulation, not for intelligence gathering. It was for the prisoners themselves, for men who had forgotten that they were human long before they were captured. The pencils became small keys, unlocking memories, fears, hopes buried beneath years of marching orders and shouted commands. In those first hesitant writings, something fragile but powerful began to grow, a recognition that identity could survive even the darkest war. And none of them knew it yet, but the act of writing would do what bullets never could. It would begin to change the men they were. There comes a moment in every person's life when they realize that opportunities don't come by knocking gently. They come when you create enough inner power to pull them toward you. And one of the most overlooked ways to build that power is by mastering your internal dialogue. The way you speak to yourself becomes the blueprint for how life responds to you. If you constantly tell yourself you're not ready, not talented enough, not lucky enough, not supported enough, life simply agrees. But the moment you shift that internal language, even slightly, the energy of your entire world begins to rearrange itself. You start giving yourself permission to rise, permission to try again, permission to be bold, to be seen, to be heard, to be capable. That single shift creates a magnetic field around you, and suddenly resources, guidance, and opportunities that once felt distant begin moving toward you. Your mind listens to you more than it listens to anyone else. People can cheer for you, clap for you, push you, praise you, but if your inner voice whispers weakness, doubt, scarcity, or fear, that becomes your reality. Greatness begins the moment you replace self-criticism with self-coaching. Instead of saying, "I can't," you ask, "How can I?" Instead of saying, "This is too hard," you say, "This is preparing me." Instead of saying, "What if I fail?" you say, "What if this becomes the greatest move of my life?" One shift in language becomes one shift in belief. One shift in belief becomes one shift in action. And one shift in action becomes an entirely new life. Every successful person you admire had to fight their mind before they ever fought the world. They had to rewire decades of fear-based thinking. They had to talk themselves out of quitting, out of staying small, out of settling for average. Their external success is only a reflection of thousands of unseen inner battles that they won silently. When you change the way you speak to yourself, even your posture changes, your confidence changes, your energy changes, and people feel that shift when you walk into a room. Opportunities feel it too. You must become your own mentor, your own motivator, your own source of courage. Speak to yourself the way a great coach would speak to their strongest player. Firm, loving, demanding, empowering. Remind yourself daily, I deserve growth. I deserve progress. I deserve abundance. I deserve to be the person I've always imagined. When you repeat empowering words long enough, they stop sounding like motivation and start sounding like truth. And once something becomes your truth, it becomes your identity. And once it becomes your identity, you no longer chase opportunities. Opportunities chase you. Your inner voice is the steering wheel of your destiny. If you let fear hold it, you stay parked forever. But if you take control, even slowly, even shakily, even unsure, the direction of your life changes. Speak strength. Speak vision. Speak courage. Speak abundance. The world rises for people who rise from within first. There comes a moment in every person's life when they realize that opportunities don't come by knocking gently. They come when you create enough inner power to pull them toward you. And one of the most overlooked ways to build that power is by mastering your internal dialogue. The way you speak to yourself becomes the blueprint for how life responds to you. If you constantly tell yourself you're not ready, not talented enough, not lucky enough, not supported enough, life simply agrees. But the moment you shift that internal language, even slightly, the energy of your entire world begins to rearrange itself. You start giving yourself permission to rise, permission to try again, permission to be bold, to be seen, to be heard, to be capable. That single shift creates a magnetic field around you, and suddenly resources, guidance, and opportunities that once felt distant begin moving toward you. Your mind listens to you more than it listens to anyone else. People can cheer for you, clap for you, push you, praise you. But if your inner voice whispers weakness, doubt, scarcity, or fear, that becomes your reality. Greatness begins the moment you replace self-criticism with self-coaching. Instead of saying, I can't, you ask, how can I? Instead of saying, this is too hard, you say, this is preparing me. Instead of saying, what if I fail, you say, what if this becomes the greatest move of my life? One shift in language becomes one shift in belief. One shift in belief becomes one shift in action. And one shift in action becomes an entirely new life. Every successful person you admire had to fight their mind before they ever fought the world. They had to rewire decades of fear-based thinking. They had to talk themselves out of quitting, out of staying small, out of settling for average. Their external success is only a reflection of thousands of unseen inner battles that they won silently. When you change the way you speak to yourself, even your posture changes, your confidence changes, your energy changes, and people feel that shift when you walk into a room. Opportunities feel it too. You must become your own mentor, your own motivator, your own source of courage. Speak to yourself the way a great coach would speak to their strongest player. Firm, loving, demanding, empowering. Remind yourself daily, I deserve growth. I deserve progress. I deserve abundance. I deserve to be the person I've always imagined. When you repeat empowering words long enough, they stop sounding like motivation and start sounding like truth. And once something becomes your truth, it becomes your identity. And once it becomes your identity, you no longer chase opportunities. Opportunities chase you. Your inner voice is the steering wheel of your destiny. If you let fear hold it, you stay parked forever. But if you take control, even slowly, even shakily, even unsure, the direction of your life changes. Speak strength. Speak vision. Speak courage. Speak abundance. The world rises for people who rise from within first.